The roar came just after sunrise, raw, ancient, and heartbreakingly loud. It tore through the silence of the Rocky Mountains like a prophecy no one had expected. For 12 years, the tiger named Dakota had remained silent. But on that morning, he stood tall near the fence for the first time in half a decade, and called out to something that no one else could see. It wasn't a call of anger, it was a memory. Waking up. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Early morning mist clung to the trees like faded silk, curling through the branches of ponderosa pines that towered over the eastern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. The air was crisp, laced with the cool scent of dew-dampened bark and early summer soil. A hush covered the sanctuary grounds, the kind of stillness only found at the beginning of day in the deep woods of Colorado, just beyond the visitor walkway. Nestled inside a massive enclosure flanked by natural rock walls and double-layered fences, moved a creature rarely seen by the public. Dakota. Dakota was a 12-year-old male Bengal tiger, immense and commanding, his thick coat of orange and black now flecked with strands of gray around the jowls. But his most remarkable feature wasn't physical. It was his silence. Unlike the more social big cats in the reserve, Dakota avoided interaction. He didn't prowl near the observation fences. He didn't roar. He barely acknowledged the humans who brought him food. Rangers often described him as a presence more than an animal, a ghost pacing the tree line, which is why, when the sound came, it silenced everything. A roar, deep, raw, and thunderous, rose from the pines like something torn from another time. It was not angry. It was not territorial. It was something else entirely. It rolled over the treetops and echoed down the trails, stopping hikers mid-step and scattering birds into frantic flight. On the upper observation deck, a group of tourists and 2 rangers froze. They instinctively turned toward the tiger enclosure, where Dakota now stood, visible, upright, still. For the first time in 6 years, he was out in the open, not hidden beneath cover, not watching from the shadows, and he was staring directly toward the fence, down the gravel path leading from the ranger station. An elderly man was slowly approaching. Dr. Charles Bennett, age 70, wore a wide-brimmed straw hat, a canvas safari vest over a faded navy shirt, and heavy hiking boots, though his posture had curved slightly with age, and his gait was slow. He carried a quiet dignity. His gray beard was trimmed short, his tanned skin lined with years spent beneath sun and storm. Around his neck, hanging from a leather strap, was a small, worn object, a carved wooden whistle, its edges smoothed by time and use. Charles had once been a renowned field biologist, specializing in large feline rehabilitation, but had retired over a decade ago after stepping away from active work. He hadn't returned to the sanctuary in all those years until today, as he neared the platform. Charles stopped, raising a hand to shade his eyes. Dakota hadn't moved. The tiger's body remained still, yet alert, muscles subtly taut beneath his coat. His eyes, sharp as ever, were locked not on the crowd, but on the old man. Standing among the observers was Nora Hale, a veterinary student intern from the University of Vermont. Nora was 23, slender and freckled, with messy auburn curls tucked beneath a park-issued cap. She wore a forest green ranger vest over her uniform and kept a compact digital camera hanging from her shoulder. This was her second week at the sanctuary. Curious, often quiet, and observant. She had a reputation among the staff for asking thoughtful questions and scribbling too many notes. at the sound of the roar. She had instinctively lifted her camera and snapped a burst of shots, capturing Dakota's full figure, the rare eye contact, and the approach of Dr. Bennett. She didn't yet understand what she was witnessing, but something about it felt off-script. Has he ever done that before? She whispered, stepping closer to one of the senior rangers, a woman named Grace. Grace shook her head slowly, eyes wide, not once, not in 6 years. Nora turned her gaze back to Dakota, now visibly alert, still fixated on Dr. Bennett. The tiger inched forward, just a few steps, but enough to break his long-held boundary with the fence line. Nora's fingers found her pen instinctively. She flipped open the small notebook in her pocket and began to write. She didn't know it yet, but this would be the first page in a story that would change everything they thought they knew about Dakota. The air that afternoon was drier than usual, carrying the scent of crushed pine needles and sun-warmed stone as the clouds lifted above the mountain ridge. The sanctuary was quieter now. Visitors had been ushered out early under the pretense of an animal health check. Though most of the staff knew better, something had changed. Something that didn't fit into any chart or protocol. Dakota was lying down near the observation fence, his great body stretched along a patch of flattened grass. But his eyes, those fierce, amber eyes, remained open, fixed toward the ranger's path where Dr. Charles Bennett still stood. The tiger's breathing had slowed, but the tension beneath his skin had not faded. He was waiting. Charles, for his part, had not moved far. He now leaned gently against a nearby boulder, his fingers loosely clasped around the wooden whistle hanging from his wrist. His eyes were glassy. He seemed not to notice the whispers from nearby rangers, nor the wide-eyed glances from staff. All he could see was the tiger before him and the years unraveling behind those eyes. Ranger Talia Brooks, a lean black woman in her early 40s, approached cautiously. Talia was known for her no-nonsense attitude and hawk-like precision. Her hair was tied back in a long braid, and her uniform was crisp despite the long shift. "Dr. Bennett," she said quietly, "I think we should get you inside. There's a bench under the shade." Her voice softened, betraying her usual firmness. "You look like you need a moment." Charles nodded absently but didn't speak until he sat. "He shouldn't remember," he said at last, as if confessing a secret. "It's been too long. But that look—" He trailed off, turning the whistle over in his hand. That was not instinct. Nora Hale watched the exchange from a short distance, tucked half behind a young pine, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her camera now hung from her neck, unused. She had seen many things in her years volunteering in wildlife centers and shelters, but never this. Curiosity buzzed in her chest like static. When Charles had spoken of memory, of the tiger remembering him, something old and sharp had stirred in Nora. She needed to know more. That night, long after the sun dipped behind the ridgeline and only the moonlight veiled the forest in silver, Nora found herself alone in the records room of the sanctuary's modest administration cabin. The wooden shelves creaked under the weight of binders, manila folders, and yellowed photographs. She flipped on the desk lamp and set her laptop beside her notebook. She located Dakota's intake file easily. It had been labeled with a bright red tab. High-risk transfer. Origin. Confidential. She scanned the pages. Weight, health history, feeding patterns, tranquilizer doses, everything was clinical, sterile. There was a short line under History, transferred from Federal Holding. Origin, under Protective Classification. Protective Classification, she muttered aloud. That wasn't standard. She flipped to the attached photo. It showed a gaunt young tiger cub, ribs sharp under its hide, eyes hollow and defeated, no name listed, just subject F8. A metallic clink made her glance down. A small brass paperclip had slipped from the page, and something beneath it caught her attention. A second photo, badly faded and water-damaged, was tucked behind the intake page in it. A much younger Charles Bennett, still graying but strong, crouched beside the same tiger cub. Charles's hand rested gently on the cub's back, around his wrist. The same wooden whistle. Nora's breath caught. She flipped to the back of the folder, searching for transfer documentation. But the pages stopped abruptly. The final document was dated 6 months before Dakota's arrival. There were no transport logs, no veterinarian records from Florida, and no mention of the facility where the cub had originated. Pages were missing. Deliberately. Nora sat back in her chair, blinking into the lamplight. Why would someone erase parts of the tiger's past? And why was a whistle, the kind used for simple cue training, evoking such a strong reaction in one of the most reclusive animals in the sanctuary? She closed the folder carefully and pressed her fingers to her temple. This wasn't just a reunion. This was a story that someone had tried to bury. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with warm streaks of sunlight piercing through the mist. Dakota was seen pacing again. A slow, almost deliberate walk that hugged the edges of the enclosure fence. He would stop, stare toward the trees, and then continue. Some of the rangers believed he was scanning for prey. Nora wasn't so sure. Back at the ranger lodge, Charles sat with Talia on the wooden porch. Sipping lukewarm tea, he looked tired, but more centered than the day before. "I should have come sooner," he said after a long silence. "I kept telling myself it would be too disruptive, that he'd forgotten." Talia tilted her head, but he didn't. "No," Charles said softly. "He didn't." He took a breath, eyes fixed on the distant pines. 15 years ago, I helped shut down a private breeding facility in Florida. Underground, illegal, brutal. He set down his cup. That's where I found him, shackled, starved, barely moving. He shouldn't have survived, but he did. "You named him," Talia asked, "not officially." Charles said, "They don't let you." "But between us, I called him Dakota. After the river I grew up near, and you kept him. For nearly 3 years. I rehabilitated him myself. He slept near me, ate from my hand. I trained him with that whistle." He paused. 3 blows meant, "It's okay. You're safe." And then Charles exhaled. Then the order came. He was to be relocated to a sanctuary for long-term care. A classified transfer, no contact allowed afterward. I thought he'd forget. Talia didn't speak. There wasn't much to say. Behind them, Nora appeared in the doorway, holding the open file folder, her eyes burning with questions. The wind shifted that morning, curling through the dense evergreens with an almost watchful stillness. Clouds hung low above the Rocky Mountains, casting broad shadows across the sanctuary grounds, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The air was sharp but not cold, and the silence held weight, like the pause before revelation. Inside the staff headquarters, the atmosphere was no less heavy. Nora Hale stood across from the park's senior administrator, her hands clasped tightly around the file folder containing Dakota's incomplete records. Spread out on the desk between them were a half-dozen pages Nora had assembled, photocopies, scanned documents, a grainy but telling photograph of a younger Dr. Charles Bennett kneeling beside a frail tiger cub. The image alone had silenced any lingering doubts. Across the desk sat Dale Whitmore, the park's director. He was a stout, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, With thinning red-gray hair and sun-creased cheeks, a former ranger turned administrator. Dale had the stern demeanor of someone who lived and died by policy, but there was an undeniable kindness behind his square-framed glasses. He had always been fair with staff, but rarely sentimental. Now. He looked at the photo with a frown of concern. "This was withheld," he said quietly, tapping the edge of the image with a blunt finger. "And not by accident." Nora nodded. "There are gaps in the chain of custody records. Medical logs are missing. I've traced some veterinary notes to a holding facility that was shut down by federal order in 2010. And that," she said, pointing to the photo, "is our tiger. That's Dakota." Dale leaned back in his creaking chair. "You're saying Charles raised him for almost 3 years?" Nora replied. "He didn't just rehabilitate him. He trained him, fed him, slept near him." Dakota responded to the whistle. He remembered. Dale exhaled slowly. He picked up the photo, stared at it for a long moment, and then made a decision. "We'll confirm his identity officially. I'll submit the image and records to the Wildlife Historical Registry. In the meantime," he paused, "let's give Dr. Bennett access. Carefully, by late afternoon." The arrangements were made. A temporary observation station had been set up closer to Dakota's enclosure. With reinforced glass and a clear line of sight, security protocols remained in place, tranquilizer staff on standby, visual monitors engaged, but this meeting would not be interrupted unless necessary. Charles arrived just as the sky softened to gold, wearing a light gray coat and a knitted scarf that hung loose around his shoulders. In his hand was a small bundle wrapped in a cloth pouch, faded blue, frayed at the edges. He walked slowly, one step at a time, every movement deliberate. Dakota was already waiting. The tiger stood near the fence, silent, his broad head lowered, but his eyes sharp and attentive. As Charles approached the edge of the secure boundary, he knelt, despite the stiffness in his knees, and held out the cloth. "I kept this," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Your blanket, from when you were a cub, the blue fabric, once a part of an old scarf, had been wrapped around the tiger the first night Charles rescued him. Years ago in Florida, it had absorbed the scent of milk, antiseptic, and the musk of a terrified cub. Now, it smelled only of memory." Dakota moved forward slowly, his massive paws soundless against the earth. He stopped mere inches from the reinforced partition. Then, with the gentleness of something sacred, he pressed his nose to the glass and inhaled deeply. The sound that followed was not a roar, it was lower, more intimate, a deep, resonant purr that vibrated through the air like a hum from the earth's core. Tears welled in Charles's eyes, on the other side of the viewing bay, behind the security screen. Talia Brooks watched with a knot in her throat. "I've worked with big cats 20 years, she whispered to the technician beside her. "I've never heard one do that." Across the compound, Nora stood beneath a leaning pine, fingers wrapped around her phone. She wasn't recording, only watching, as if she too might wake from the moment. But in her other hand was a second list, something new. She had spent the previous night combing through federal wildlife seizure records, cross-referencing dates, locations, and known survivors from the same illegal breeding operation where Dakota had once been held. The names were few, but there were others. Other tigers. Others who had made it out. One, a female named Asha, had been transferred to a wildlife center in Arizona. Another, a male called Ravi, was listed at a rehabilitation ranch in Montana. A third, unknown ID, male, presumed untrackable, was last seen en route to a private zoo in Texas, before disappearing from official logs entirely. They were scattered now, forgotten by the system, but they were alive. Nora's heart pounded as she opened a new browser tab on her phone and drafted an email to a contact she had in Arizona, an old professor now working with a wildlife trust. She typed quickly, looking for a female Bengal transferred from federal seizure in 2010. Her name may be Asha. Do you have records? Need confirmation of origin? Possible link to Rocky Mountain case? She hit send. Then she looked back across the field, where a dying man and a tiger were quietly remembering each other through the glass. It wasn't just science anymore. It was something far older than data, deeper than instinct. It was recognition. Sunlight poured gently through the forest canopy, weaving golden paths across the stone and soil of the sanctuary's southern trail. For the first time in weeks, the air was lighter, touched with the smell of warmed earth and pine resin. A soft breeze whispered across the fences and stirred the long grass around the tiger enclosure, where Dakota, now visibly calmer, lay sprawled beneath the shade of a tall fir, eyes half closed, tail gently swaying. He was different now. Where once he had prowled in silence, aloof and unreadable, Dakota had begun to engage with his environment, with the keepers, even with sound. He vocalized softly in the mornings, a deep, chuffing noise that seemed to ripple through the enclosure like a question left hanging in the trees. Rangers reported that he had resumed regular eating schedules, accepted the presence of caretakers more easily, and had even, on 2 separate occasions, paced near the fence line as if waiting for something. That something, as it turned out, was a sound. 3 short, clear notes from the wooden whistle. Charles Bennett had been rising each day just before dawn, walking slowly with the aid of a cane down the gravel path to the edge of Dakota's enclosure, where a wooden bench now stood beneath a canvas awning. He would sit, winded but content, and raise the whistle to his lips. The sound wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. 3 notes, a pause, and always, from within the trees, a response. 3 measured thumps from Dakota's great paw against the earth. This ritual had become something of a legend within the sanctuary. Staff paused their routines to watch it unfold, and even visitors, though kept at a respectful distance, were quietly moved by it. Some of the younger rangers referred to it simply as the bridge. It was Nora Hale, however, who understood its weight most fully. She had begun taking notes not just as a student, but as a witness. Every detail of Dakota's behavior, every whistle exchange, every new vocalization. It was all cataloged in a series of journals that now lined the shelf in her shared cabin. She had even begun to sketch him, capturing the subtle changes in his posture, the lift of his ears, the slow softening in his expression. And she recorded Charles, too, his patience, his ritual, the tired strength he poured into each breath of that whistle. But Charles was growing weaker. On the 2nd Sunday of the month, Nora arrived at the bench to find him already seated, wrapped in a navy cardigan, hands trembling slightly as he turned a small handheld camera over in his lap. "I'd like to record something," he said, without looking up. For him, for when I'm gone, the camera was a simple one, well worn, with duct tape holding the battery cover in place, but it worked. Nora sat beside him, adjusting the frame, angling it to catch both man and enclosure behind. Charles cleared his throat. "Dakota," he began, his voice soft but steady. "If you're watching this, I want you to know you were never forgotten. You were never just a rescue, never just a project. You were my companion, my miracle." He lifted the whistle to the camera and let it rest in his palm. This sound meant safety. It meant family. If someday you forget, that's all right, but I hope you'll always feel it. Somewhere in your bones." He blew it 3 times from the trees beyond the glass. A low growl vibrated the air, and 3 heavy thumps followed. Charles smiled faintly and turned off the camera. That evening, Charles handed the video file to Nora and pressed the wooden whistle into her hand. "If he grows restless," he said, "remind him and let him remind you." 2. While Charles's health quietly declined, Nora's mission grew in urgency. Among the 3 other tigers she had located weeks ago, one had drawn particular concern. Asha, a 13-year-old female Bengal currently held at a private reserve in Arizona. Asha had been rescued from the same breeding operation as Dakota, but had suffered internal organ damage due to years of malnutrition. Her current caregivers had reported deteriorating health and limited resources. Nora made contact with the reserve's head veterinarian, Dr. Lena Torres, a stern but warm woman in her late 40s with thick black curls pinned in a bun and a raspy voice softened by a southern accent. Lena had worked for nearly 2 decades in large animal recovery, and her bluntness belied deep compassion. "She's declining fast," Lena said during a late-night call. "The reserve's doing its best, but we don't have the facilities. You think your place can take her?" "We'll find a way," Nora replied. "We've taken rescues before. We'll make room." Over the following days, Nora worked behind the scenes, drafting an urgent proposal to Dale Whitmore and coordinating with logistics staff. She enlisted help from Samir Patel, the sanctuary's new transport coordinator, a slender man in his early 30s, practical and calm, with sharp gray eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of interstate wildlife permits. Samir had grown up in Oregon, the son of 2 botanists, and had long since traded plant life for predator logistics. "It's gonna be tight," he told her, poring over the paperwork. "But if we route through Albuquerque and time it right, she'll be here in 3 days." Nora nodded. "She won't make it if we wait longer." The sanctuary board approved the emergency relocation late Thursday afternoon. Nora stood outside as the sun dipped below the tree line, the whistle Charles had given her still warm in her palm, somewhere behind her. Dakota paced in the trees, stopping every so often to glance toward the south trail, toward the future that was, perhaps, quietly being built around him. The last frost of winter had melted into the veins of spring, leaving the forest floor soft beneath a scatter of pine needles and fresh shoots. Wind moved gently through the Rocky Mountain sanctuary, carrying the scent of new growth and distant thunder. For the first time in weeks, the sky was entirely clear, no haze, no looming clouds, just a broad canvas of blue stretched wide over the pines. But there was no peace in the hearts of those who worked the land that morning. 2 weeks had passed since Dr. Charles Bennett had slipped away in his sleep, and something in the forest had changed. It happened on a Wednesday. The sanctuary had just begun its morning routines when the sound broke across the hills. A roar, not of anger nor alarm, but something deeper, long, aching, and filled with something that sounded like longing. It came from Dakota's enclosure and rolled across the compound like a wave. Rangers dropped tools. Visitors froze mid-step. Birds scattered from the trees. It was the first time Dakota had roared since Charles's death. Nora Hale had been standing outside the newly completed wildlife center when she heard it. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "He knows." From that day forward, each evening at exactly 5:00 p.m., she walked the short trail to Dakota's enclosure, took the wooden whistle Charles had entrusted to her, and blew 3 soft notes, and each time, Dakota whether lying beneath the trees or perched atop the stone ledge he favored, rose to his feet and stamped the ground 3 times. It became more than a habit. It became a ritual, a bridge from what had been to what still endured. The sanctuary changed in quiet ways, too. Where once Dakota had kept to himself, he now watched more often. He lingered near the fence when Nora came. He rumbled softly when other animals passed. The old sadness in his eyes remained, but it no longer held him captive. Something had softened, and with it came a new era of trust. He was still a tiger, still wild, but there was peace where once there had been only silence. 3 years passed. In that time, Nora Hale changed too. She grew into her role as the sanctuary's director, taking over not just operations but the legacy Charles had unknowingly left in her hands. With the help of Dale Whitmore and Samir Patel, she expanded the sanctuary's capacity, partnering with regional rescue centers, and initiating the first cross-state relocation project for high-risk predators. But her proudest work stood nestled beneath a cedar grove on the sanctuary's eastern ridge, the Hope Center for Wildlife Restoration. Its name came from a tiger. Hope had arrived ill and nearly skeletal, transported from the Arizona facility in critical condition. She was barely strong enough to stand, but under Nora's care and the expert medical oversight of Dr. Lena Torres, who had since moved permanently to Colorado, Hope had survived. Not just survived, thrived. She was 6 now, sleek, agile, fiercely curious. Her golden-orange coat glowed in the sun, and her soft growls had become a comforting soundtrack to staff and visitors alike. Her enclosure stood not far from Dakota's, and it was not uncommon to see the 2 tigers watching one another through the trees, silent companions who had both once been forgotten. The center bore a carved emblem over its entrance. A wooden whistle crossed over a paw print. It became a symbol for the sanctuary's mission, connection, memory, and healing. On a warm spring morning, a silver SUV made its way up the sanctuary's winding road. In the passenger seat sat Nora, now 30, her hair pulled back into a long ponytail flecked with copper strands. In her lap sat a small boy, no older than 3, bundled in a navy fleece and clutching a new wooden whistle, freshly carved with care and polished to a soft sheen. His name was Eli, her son. He had Charles' eyes as they parked near the observation deck. Nora lifted him from the seat, balancing him on her hip. He was curious but quiet, eyes wide as they took in the towering trees, the distant shapes of enclosures, and the earthy scent of tiger musk in the breeze. Nora knelt beside him at the fence and helped guide the whistle to his lips. "Just like I showed you," she said gently. Eli blew 3 short, uncertain notes for a moment. There was only silence. Then, deep in the enclosure, the tall grass parted. Dakota stepped forward. He was older now, his muzzle streaked with gray, the muscle beneath his shoulders less defined, but he still moved with the measured grace of a monarch. He approached the fence slowly, stopped just a few feet from the mother and child, and looked down. Then, with a motion so deliberate it felt ceremonial, he lowered his head until his forehead brushed the earth and thumped his paw. Once, twice, 3 times. Eli laughed, eyes bright, and clapped his hands. Behind them, Dale Whitmore stood in quiet awe. "You know," he murmured to Lena Torres, who had joined him, "I thought Charles was a romantic, imagining all that memory in a tiger." Lena smiled softly. Arms crossed, he wasn't wrong. The moment passed into memory, but it would be told again and again at ranger talks, in sanctuary tours, and whispered between keepers over campfires, because it wasn't just a tiger bowing to a child, It was a promise being passed down somewhere, just beyond the trees. Hope let out a low, echoing call, a soft exhale into the morning light. Perhaps she understood what had happened, or perhaps it was instinct. But Nora believed it was more, because tigers never forget, in a world that often forgets. This story reminds us that love remembers, through the bond between a dying man and a tiger he once saved. We are shown that true connection transcends time, language, even death itself. Dakota did not forget the hand that fed him, the voice that comforted him, or the whistle that meant safety, just as we, in our own lives, carry pieces of love from those who shaped us, parents, mentors, friends, and even animals. So too does the soul remember what the mind may lose. Some would call it memory. Others might call it instinct, but perhaps it is something more, a miracle, a whisper from God that tells us. Nothing done in love is ever wasted in our daily lives. We often rush past moments that matter, overlook the quiet bonds, and underestimate the depth of what we give to others. But just like the wooden whistle that passed from hand to hand, what we plant in love may bloom long after we are gone. So let us live with kindness, let us love with intention, and let us remember, even the silent creatures of the wild carry within them the echoes of grace. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below to honor someone you've never forgotten. And if you believe that God works in mysterious, beautiful ways, even through the heart of a tiger, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories that reveal the miracles hidden in the everyday, and may God bless you. Always.